Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey back to a dimly lit Parisian pharmacy, a place smelling of dried herbs and antiseptic, where a peculiar transaction is about to take place. You're standing there, a silent observer, as a man with a neatly trimmed beard and a serious expression hands over a small fortune for something he hopes will be his claim to fame. It's not some rare perfume or an exotic remedy. No, it's a dusty, centuries-old jar, its contents shrouded in mystery and the promise of a legend. This isn't just a story about history. It's a tale about the intoxicating pull of the past and the desperate lengths we go to touch it, to hold a piece of it in our hands. The jar, we're told, holds the scorched remains of one of history's most iconic figures, a simple peasant girl who became a warrior saint. Of course, you probably won't survive this journey unscathed, as the line between faith and fraud blurs in the most unsettling ways. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your location and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: Paris, 1867. The city is a vibrant tapestry of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages, a hub of intellectual fervour and scientific discovery. Our story, however, doesn't begin in a grand salon or a university hall, but in the quiet, unassuming shop of one Monsieur Albert Hachette, a pharmacist. Hachette is a man of his time, an amateur historian with a passion for collecting. His latest acquisition, however, is a particularly macabre curiosity. It's a small terracotta jar, its surface darkened with age and grime. The lid is sealed with a leaden cap, and on the front a faded inscription. You lean closer, your eyes squinting in the low light. The letters are worn but legible. Remains found on the funeral pyre of Joan of Arc, Virgin Martyr, Rouen. A chill runs up your spine. It sounds too perfect, doesn't it? A tangible link to one of the most famous women in all of history. But Hachette, a pragmatist by trade, isn't immediately convinced. He's a man of science, after all. He examines the jar, the seal, the inscription, his mind already cataloguing 100 questions. Where did it come from? Who preserved these remains, and why? The story he's been told is as thin as a single page of parchment, a whisper passed down through generations. A French official, present at the execution, supposedly gathered the ashes from the pyre and spirited them away. It's a tale that tugs at the heartstrings, but it's completely lacking in evidence. Still, the lure is too strong to resist. The thought of owning a piece of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, is a powerful one, and Hachette finds himself opening his wallet. Inside the jar, the contents are exactly as described: charred human remains. There are fragments of bone, some blackened material that could be wood or cloth, and something else, a dark, gritty powder. Hachette carefully sifts through it all, his pharmacist's sensibilities kicking in. He notices a few oddities. The remains are remarkably well preserved for their supposed age. And what's that smell? A faint but distinct scent of something perfumed. It's not what you'd expect from a pile of ashes that had been exposed to the elements for over 4 centuries. This is where the story gets really interesting. Hachette, in a stroke of either genius or naivety, decides to go public with his discovery. He writes to a respected historian and archivist, someone whose reputation for meticulous research is beyond reproach. His name is Jacques H., and he's about to become the central figure in our tale. Jacques H. receives Hachette's letter and a small sample of the remains. He is, to put it mildly, captivated. This is the kind of puzzle that a man like him lives for, a mystery steeped in history waiting to be unravelled. And so, the great investigation begins. To understand the weight of this discovery, you need to understand who Joan of Arc was, and what her legacy meant to 19th century France. This is our mainstream historical fact. Joan was a peasant girl from a small village who, at the age of 17, convinced the Dauphin to let her lead the French army against the English. She claimed to have been guided by divine voices and visions. Against all odds she was successful, lifting the siege of Orleans and leading the Dauphin to be crowned King Charles VII. But her luck ran out. She was captured, sold to the English, and put on trial for heresy. The English and their Burgundian allies wanted to discredit her, and, by extension, the king she had crowned. Her trial was a farce, a politically motivated sham. She was ultimately condemned and on May 30th, 1431, burned at the stake in the public square of Rouen. The trial records state that her body was completely consumed by the flames, and her ashes were scattered into the River Seine, a final act of cruelty meant to prevent her supporters from turning her into a martyr. It's this specific historical detail that makes the jar's contents so provocative. If her remains were indeed scattered, how could this jar exist? This is the central paradox that Jacques H. will have to confront. The sheer improbability of the jar's existence is what makes it so fascinating to Hachette, and later to the French public. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The concept of historical relics in the Middle Ages was big business. A piece of a saint's bone, a sliver of the true cross, even a strand of a martyr's hair. These were highly prized, believed to possess divine power. And where there's a market, there are always unscrupulous entrepreneurs. The story of a French peasant girl's divine intervention resonated deeply with the nationalistic spirit of 19th century France. The country, fresh from a series of political upheavals, was looking for heroes to rally around. Joan of Arc, a symbol of French defiance and faith, was the perfect candidate. The timing of Hachette's discovery was, shall we say, impeccable. So, Jacques H. begins his work. He's a man of letters, not a scientist, and his methods are a blend of archival research and a healthy dose of intuition. He pores over the trial records, the chronicles of the time, searching for any mention of what happened to Joan's remains. He looks for loopholes, for inconsistencies. Did the English really manage to burn every last piece of her? Was it possible that a few fragments were left behind, unnoticed in the chaos? He consults with other historians, sparking a lively, if often heated, debate. Historians still argue whether the English's claim to have scattered her ashes was entirely truthful, or simply a political statement. The truth, as is often the case with history, is a muddy and convoluted affair. You follow Jacques as he meticulously cross-references documents, his long fingers tracing lines of Latin text in a dusty book. He's a historical detective, and the jar in the pharmacy is his crime scene. He can't use DNA analysis or carbon dating. Those tools are centuries in the future. Instead, he must rely on the limited scientific methods available to him. He examines the bones under a magnifying glass, noting their size and shape. Are they consistent with the remains of a young woman? He analyses the strange powdery substance, trying to identify its components. This is the beginning of historical forensics, and it's a fascinating, if primitive, process. The journey to authenticate this jar is a wild one, a roller coaster of hope and doubt, and you're strapped in for the ride. You're a fly on the wall in Jacques H.'s Essie study, a room crammed with dusty books and rolled-up parchments. The air smells of old paper and beeswax. Jacques himself, a figure of intellectual gravity, is hunched over a small table, a magnifying glass held to his eye. The focus of his obsession is a tiny fragment of bone, a splinter of history no bigger than your thumbnail. Hachette, the pharmacist, has entrusted him with this momentous task, and Jacques takes it with the solemnity of a high priest. His reputation as a meticulous archivist and historian is on the line. He's not a showman. He's a man who lives for the quiet truth found in the margins of a centuries-old manuscript. The initial investigation is a fascinating blend of old-world scholarship and nascent forensic science. Jacques H. can't simply send the remains off to a lab for DNA testing. That technology is still a century away, a fantastical dream of some futuristic inventor. Instead, he must rely on the tools available to him, his vast knowledge of medieval history, his sharp intellect, and a set of rudimentary chemical tests. He knows that the first step is to establish the provenance of the jar itself. A claim, no matter how extraordinary, is only as good as the evidence backing it up. He begins by tracing the jar's history. Hachette bought it from an antique dealer, who got it from a collector, who in turn claimed it came from a private family collection. The story is a convoluted mess of hearsay and faded memory. The jar supposedly belonged to a French official who was at Joan's execution, a man named Pierre de Thérèse. According to the tale, he gathered the ashes from the pyre and kept them as a relic, a defiant act against the English who had ordered the desecration. This, Jacques realises, is a perfect story. A little too perfect, perhaps. It fits neatly into the narrative of French patriotism and martyrdom. It's the kind of story that sells. The historian in Jacques H. is sceptical. He knows that most official accounts claim the English were thorough. They wanted to ensure there was nothing left to worship. They even held a second burning to reduce the body to fine ash, and then dumped everything into the Seine. The English were a bit extra about it, you might say, really trying to make a point. So, the idea of a French official casually scooping up a handful of remains right under their noses seems unlikely. Jacques H. digs into the archives, poring over records of French officials present at the execution. He finds no mention of a Pierre de Thérèse. The name simply doesn't appear in the list of attendees. This is the first crack in the jar's story. He turns his attention to the physical evidence. The contents of the jar, bone fragments, charred wood, and that peculiar dark powder. This is where he has to think like a scientist. He examines the bone fragments. They are small and brittle, but they appear to be human. He carefully measures them, compares them to anatomical charts. They seem to be from the upper body. A rib fragment, a piece of a vertebra, maybe a finger bone, all consistent with a human skeleton. But are they the remains of a young woman? It's impossible to tell with the methods of the 19th century. Gender and age determination from such small fragments is a job for 21st century forensic anthropologists, not a 19th century archivist with a magnifying glass. Jacques H. then focuses on the charred material. Is it wood from the pyre? He compares it to samples of known medieval wood. It's consistent. It could be from a pyre, or it could be from any other fire. But the dark powder is the most intriguing. It has a distinctive smell, something he can't quite place. He decides to perform a basic chemical test, a simple litmus test. He dissolves a small amount of the powder in water and dips a piece of litmus paper into it. The paper turns a faint shade of pink. It's acidic. He tries a few other tests, mixing a tiny bit with different reagents. The results are inconclusive, but he notes the strange persistent smell. It's not the smell of burnt flesh or wood, but something else entirely. This is our quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the prevailing theories at the time, championed by a few fringe academics, was that the English, in their haste, had mixed the ashes with something else to make them unrecognisable. The theory was that they might have used some sort of chemical agent to speed up the process of burning, or to create a more potent symbolic destruction. It's a wild, unsubstantiated theory, but it shows the lengths people were willing to go to explain the jar's existence. The simple fact that a jar of remains could exist at all, despite the historical record, was a paradox that demanded an extraordinary explanation. Jacques H. is a realist. He knows he can't prove the remains are Joan's with the evidence he has, but he also can't disprove it. The evidence is simply too circumstantial. The lack of a historical record for the jar's owner, the convenience of the story, and the oddities of the remains all point to a forgery. Yet the fervent desire for a tangible connection to Joan of Arc is a powerful force. A mainstream historical fact here is that the veneration of saints and their relics was a cornerstone of Catholicism for centuries, creating a massive industry. The market for relics, both genuine and fake, was huge. This provided a perfect cover for an enterprising forger. So Jacques H. is walking a tightrope between his professional skepticism and the emotional, patriotic pull of the story. He decides to go public with his findings, but with a cautious tone. He writes an academic paper detailing his investigation. He presents the evidence for the jar's authenticity, the human remains, the plausible story of the official, and then he presents the counter-evidence, the lack of a paper trail, the inconsistent details, and the strange chemical composition. This is a moment of intellectual honesty. He doesn't make a definitive claim, but he invites a larger scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Jacques H's initial caution was a sign of his intellectual integrity or an act of cowardice in the face of immense public pressure. The public reaction is immediate and overwhelming. The jar becomes a sensation. People flock to Hachette's pharmacy to catch a glimpse of the relics. Joan of Arc, the national hero, is suddenly not just a character in a history book, but a physical presence, a real person whose remains could be seen and venerated. The jar is a rallying point for French patriots, a symbol of national pride. Hachette, the pharmacist, becomes an unlikely celebrity. Jacques H., the meticulous archivist, is suddenly a public figure, a man at the centre of a storm of controversy. You feel a wave of sympathy for Jacques H. He's a man of reason and logic, suddenly caught in a world of faith and emotion. He's tried to be a detective, but the public sees him as a prophet. He's presented a puzzle, but they see a miracle. the sheer weight of public expectation is immense. He's not just investigating a jar, he's investigating a national myth. And you realise, as you watch him push back his chair and run a hand through his thinning hair, that this investigation isn't going to be over anytime soon. The bones in the jar have a story to tell, but it's not the one everyone wants to hear. It's a story of fraud, ambition, and the deep human need to believe in something. And the truth, as Jacques Carré is discovering, is far more complex than a simple jar of ashes. The year is 1868, and the city of Rouen, where Joan of Arc met her terrible fate, is abuzz with the news from Paris. Jacques Carré's cautious but compelling report has set off a firestorm of speculation. He's now a celebrity, a historical detective in a world hungry for heroes and mysteries. You're still there, a silent shadow in his study, watching as a parade of visitors comes and goes, fellow academics, journalists, even a few pious onlookers who simply want to be in the presence of the man who might have found a piece of their patron saint. But Jacques H. is a man of science, not spectacle. He knows his investigation is far from over. The rudimentary forensic tests he's performed so far are just the beginning. The next step is to examine the jar's contents with the best technology the 19th century can offer. This means microscopic analysis and more advanced chemical tests. He enlists the help of a respected chemist from the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle, a man with an impressive beard and a no-nonsense attitude. Together they form a strange little team, the historian with his books and the chemist with his beakers and acids. The chemist begins with the bone fragments. He examines them under a microscope, the first high-powered ones of their kind. The detail is incredible. You can see the porous, almost honeycomb-like structure of the bone. He notes that the fragments are indeed human, but he also notices something odd. The bone surfaces are not just charred, they have a strange glossy patina. It's almost as if they've been treated with something. The heat from the pyre alone shouldn't have produced this effect. It's an anomaly, a clue that points away from the simple narrative of a handful of ashes. Next, they turn to the mysterious dark powder. The chemist performs a series of more complex tests. He burns a tiny sample, noting the colour of the flame. He dissolves another sample in a stronger acid, watching for the reaction. The results are startling. He identifies traces of several organic and inorganic compounds. One of them is a form of calcium phosphate, a normal component of bone ash. But then he finds something completely unexpected, remnants of plaster, specifically calcium sulfate, or gypsum, plaster. Why would there be plaster mixed with human remains? The chemist is stumped. He can't think of any reason for its presence. It doesn't fit the story of a simple pyre. This is our mainstream historical fact. The bones of the dead, when burned on a pyre, don't just disappear. They turn to ashen fragments. The process is called cremation. But the presence of plaster suggests something else, something more deliberate. It's as if someone was trying to replicate the look of bone ash, perhaps using a substance that was easier to get or more stable. This is a big red flag, a neon sign flashing hoax. But Jacques H. is a cautious man. He's not ready to jump to conclusions. He remembers his training, never assume malice when a simple mistake could be the cause. The most bizarre discovery, our quirky or fringe tidbit, comes from the other fragments in the jar. Among the bone and charred wood, the chemist finds something that doesn't belong. He finds tiny reddish-brown fragments, unlike anything else in the jar. He performs a microscopic analysis and a simple acid test. The material doesn't dissolve like bone, it reacts differently. He concludes, with a look of utter bewilderment, that the fragments are from a cat, a domestic cat. It's a shocking revelation. The jar, which supposedly contains the remains of a virgin saint, also contains a piece of a house cat. This discovery throws the entire investigation into a tailspin. Why on earth would anyone mix cat remains with human ones? Jacques H. and the chemist are baffled. And the chemist. They're back to square one, but with a new, even more bizarre piece of evidence. The story of a brave French official scooping up a handful of Joan's ashes from the pyre suddenly seems ludicrous. Did he also scoop up a piece of a cat? It's absurd. This is where the case starts to feel less like a historical investigation and more like a macabre riddle. The presence of the cat remains gives rise to all sorts of wild theories. One, which you hear whispered in the corners of Jacques H's study, is that the cat was a medieval witch's familiar, and its remains were mixed in as part of a curse. Another theory is that the English, in their final act of cruelty, burned a cat on the pyre with Joan to mock her divine inspiration, and to symbolise her as a heretic. These are, of course, completely unsubstantiated and smack of sensationalism, but they show how desperate people were to make sense of this strange discovery. Jacques, however, is more grounded. He suspects something more mundane and, in a way, more sinister. The cat remains, combined with the plaster and the strange glossy patina on the bones, suggest not a simple mistake, but a deliberate act. He starts to think about the nature of forgeries. What would a forger in the Middle Ages or the 17th century need to make a convincing relic? They would need something to stand in for human bone. They would need a way to make it look old and charred, and they would need a story. The presence of the cat, he theorises, could be an accident. Maybe the remains were collected from a pyre that had been used for more than one purpose. Or maybe, and this is the more unsettling thought, the forger just didn't care. They were making a product, not a historical document. This brings us to a key point in our story. Jacques H. begins to formulate a new hypothesis. What if the jar's contents weren't collected from Joan's pyre at all, but were a concoction created much later? He starts to think about the time period. The French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, a time when historical artefacts were changing hands constantly. It was a chaotic period, ripe for the creation of forgeries. A jar like this with a compelling story would have been a valuable commodity. It's a plausible theory, but he knows he needs more evidence. This is a moment of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Jacques H. should have gone public with his findings at this stage, or if he should have kept his doubts private until he had more concrete proof. Some say his transparency was a credit to his intellectual honesty. Others say he should have protected the public from the pain of disillusionment. But he has no choice. The story is already out there, a runaway train of public opinion. He has to keep digging, keep searching for the truth no matter how much it hurts. He turns his attention back to the jar itself, the terracotta, the lead seal. He and the chemist examine them closely. The jar is indeed old, but how old? It's hard to say without modern dating techniques. The lead seal is even more of a mystery. It's of a type that could have been used in the 15th century, but it could also have been used much later. The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Every piece of the puzzle seems to have multiple potential meanings, and none of them point definitively to Joan of Arc. As you stand there, watching these two men of science and history work, you get a sense of the immense pressure they're under. The public wants a hero. The church wants a saint. The historians want the truth. And the bones in the jar, which have been silent for centuries, seem to be laughing at them all. They've given up a secret, but it's a secret that only raises more questions. The journey to the truth is going to be a long and winding one, and you realise you've only just begun. The jar is a time capsule, but it might not contain what anyone thinks it does. The year is 1431, and you're no longer in a Parisian pharmacy or a dusty study. You're standing in the heart of Rouen, a crowd of thousands packed into the market square. Their faces a mix of morbid curiosity and genuine sorrow. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke and damp stone. In the centre of the square, a tall wooden pyre has been erected, and on top of it, bound to a stake, is a young woman. You know her, of course. It's Joan of Arc. Her hair has been cut short, and she's dressed in a long, simple white robe. She looks impossibly young, a mere 19 years old, but her eyes hold a fierce, unwavering faith. This is the scene that the jar's story claims to have originated from, a moment of profound historical violence that forever changed the course of a nation. To truly understand the debate surrounding the jar, you must first understand the chilling details of Joan's execution. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle that Jacques H. has been piecing together. The historical record, our mainstream historical fact, is surprisingly detailed and brutal. Joan was condemned as a relapsed heretic. Her crime was wearing men's clothes again after she'd been forced to recant. The English and their allies, led by the zealous Bishop Pierre Cauchon, wanted to make an example of her. They wanted to erase her from history, or at least to ensure that she was remembered as a witch, not a saint. The sentence was death by burning. The execution itself was a spectacle, a public theatre of cruelty. A friar held a cross up to her as the flames licked at the pyre. As the smoke billowed, she cried out to Jesus, her final words a testament to her faith. The crowd was stunned into a horrified silence. Even some of the English soldiers were moved, with one supposedly exclaiming, "We are all lost. We have burned a saint." But the cruelty didn't end there. The English commander, the Earl of Warwick, was determined to leave no doubt as to her fate. He ordered the pyre to be dismantled so that everyone could see her charred corpse. This was done to prove that she hadn't escaped the flames, a common fear with heretics who were seen as having supernatural powers. The gruesome sight of her half-burned body was a final act of humiliation, but there was a second, even more significant act. The executioner was then ordered to burn the remains again, this time to the point where they were reduced to fine ashes. The goal was to prevent anyone from collecting relics. The English wanted to make sure there was nothing left to venerate. After the second burning, the executioner scooped up the ashes and the remaining heart, which had somehow survived the fire, and threw them into the Seine River. This is the central paradox that the jar in Paris poses. If the official historical record is true, and there's every reason to believe it is, then the jar simply cannot exist. There were no remains to collect. They were scattered, a deliberate and calculated act of desecration. Jacques H. knows this. He's a historian, and he has read the accounts. He knows that the story of a brave French official scooping up a handful of ashes is, at best, a myth, and at worst, a lie. It's a tale designed to bypass this uncomfortable historical fact, and yet the jar exists. The jar contains bone fragments. This is the intellectual knot that Jacques H. is trying to untangle. He knows he has to find a way to reconcile the historical account with the physical evidence in his hands. He's a detective, and the past is his crime scene. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. There's an old rumour, a piece of folklore that has been passed down through the centuries, that the executioner, a man named Geoffroy Tirage, was so horrified by what he had done that he refused to throw Joan's heart into the river. The story goes that he was so terrified of the spiritual consequences of his actions that he kept it, a grisly penance. This, of course, is completely unsubstantiated. There is no official record of it. But it's a good story, a piece of romantic fiction that has taken on a life of its own. It's the kind of tale that makes the public want to believe in the jar. This brings us to a crucial scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the English's stated intent to completely eradicate Joan's remains was truly carried out with 100% efficiency. Was it possible that a few small fragments were missed? Could some bone fragments have been buried in the charred earth of the pyre and later discovered by chance? This is the tiny crack of possibility that Jacques H. is clinging to. It's the one way he can reconcile his academic integrity with the tantalizing possibility that the jar is real. But the evidence he has, the plaster, the cat remains, the lack of a paper trail, all point to a more sinister conclusion. The jar is a fabrication, a homicide veni. The problem is, he can't say that definitively, not yet. He needs more proof. He needs to find the origin of the jar's story, not just its contents. He decides to go back to the archives, this time with a specific goal in mind. He wants to find any mention of relics related to Joan of Arc in the centuries following her death. He knows that the veneration of her as a saint didn't happen overnight. It was a long, slow process. But even before she was officially canonized, she was seen as a folk hero, a figure of national pride. Did anyone claim to have a piece of her in the 15th, 16th or 17th centuries? He spends weeks, maybe months, in the dark, silent rooms of the National Archives. He reads through old chronicles, letters and church records. He finds nothing. No mention of a jar of ashes. No mention of a secret stash of relics. The trail is completely cold. This in itself is a kind of evidence. The absence of a record in a period where people were meticulous about such things is a powerful indicator that the jar story is a modern invention, a lie retroactively applied to a found object. As you stand there watching him, you get a sense of his growing frustration. He's a man who believes in the power of the written word, the truth found in dusty manuscripts. But the jar is a physical object, a stubborn piece of reality that refuses to conform to his historical narrative. He feels like he's trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and the harder he tries, the more it hurts. He starts to suspect that the story of the official Pierre de Thérèse was simply invented wholesale to give the jar a plausible backstory. It's a classic forger's trick. Create a narrative that is both compelling and difficult to disprove. He realizes that the real mystery isn't what's in the jar, but who put it there and why. The physical contents of the jar are a distraction. The real crime is the historical one, the lie that's been told. The bones themselves are just a prop. He closes the heavy ledger he's been reading, a plume of dust rising into the air. He's at a dead end. The archives have given him all they can. The truth, he realises, is not going to be found in a book. It's going to be found in the jar itself. He has to go back to the physical evidence, back to the chemist, back to the cat remains and the plaster and the glossy patina. He has to find a way to make the jar tell its own story. The journey is taking a new turn, a more scientific one. You're no longer in the realm of history, but in the realm of forensic science. A field that is, for now, just a fledgling idea. The trail from the pyre in Rouen is a dead end. Jacques H. has meticulously scoured the archives, and the silence is deafening. There are no letters, no chronicles, no dusty church inventories mentioning a jar of Joan's ashes. The story of a brave French official, Pierre de Thérèse, has evaporated into the thin air from which it was likely conjured. It's a classic case of a fantastic narrative having no anchor in reality. So, if the jar wasn't collected from the pyre in 1431, where on earth did it come from? The question shifts from is it real to who made it and when. You're now back in the chaotic, vibrant streets of 19th century Paris, following the jar's recent history like a detective on the hunt. The jar's immediate past, before it landed in Hachette's pharmacy, is a confusing and convoluted story. This is the new front in Jacques Hios. There's investigation, a much more modern one. He interviews the antique dealer, a portly man with a penchant for long, rambling stories. The dealer is vague, a bit slippery. He claims he bought the jar from a private collector, a family that had it for generations. He can't remember the name, he says, and the man has since passed away. A convenient memory lapse, you might think. Jacques H. doesn't give up. He uses his connections, his reputation, as a respected archivist to track down the collector's family. He finds them, a polite but weary elderly couple living in a quiet apartment. They remember the jar. It was in their attic, forgotten for years, sitting in a dusty corner with old books and broken furniture. They had no idea what it was, only that their grandfather had been an amateur historian and collector. The grandfather, they tell Jacques H., had acquired the jar from a dusty old library in the countryside. He bought it as a curiosity, a conversation piece. There was a label on it, they recall, but it was so faded they couldn't read it. They sold it to the dealer for a pittance, happy to get rid of the strange, unsettling object. The paper trail, our mainstream historical fact, is a mess. It's like a game of historical telephone, from the library, to the grandfather, to the family, to the antique dealer, to Hachette the pharmacist. At each step, the story was either embellished or forgotten. The original story, if there ever was one, has been lost. The jar is a historical orphan, its lineage a jumble of hearsay and convenient amnesia. Jacques H. realises that the story on the jar's label, remains found on the funeral pyre of Joan of Arc, was likely added at some point along this chain of custody, probably by someone looking to increase its value. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, in the 18th and 19th centuries it was a common practice for private individuals to collect curiosities, often with little regard for their actual provenance. These cabinets of curiosities were precursors to modern museums. They contained everything from stuffed crocodiles to supposed unicorn horns and, yes, jars of dubious human remains. It was a time when the line between science and spectacle was incredibly blurry. The jar could have been just another oddity in a gentleman's collection, its story a bit of theatrical flair meant to impress dinner guests. The label, in this context, wasn't a historical document, it was an advertisement. This is where Jacques H. starts to formulate a new hypothesis. The jar's journey through various hands is a crucial piece of the puzzle. It shows that the jar and its contents are a found object, a historical artifact in search of a story, and someone at some point gave it a great story. The question is, why Joan of Arc? Why not some other saint or historical figure? The answer, of course, lies in the political and cultural climate of 19th century France. The country was in a period of intense nationalism. The Third Republic was rising, and figures like Joan of Arc were powerful symbols of national identity and pride. A relic of Joan was more than just a historical artifact. It was a political statement. Historians still argue whether the invention of the jar story was a conscious act of fraud or a more organic process of collective wishful thinking. Was it a cynical forger preying on patriotic sentiment, or did the story simply grow over time, fed by a public desperate for a tangible connection to their hero? It's a fascinating debate, and Jack H. finds himself in the middle of it. He's a man who believes in facts, but he's surrounded by people who believe in stories. The fact that the jar's provenance is so flimsy is a powerful piece of evidence against its authenticity. A real relic of Joan of Arc would have a meticulously documented history. It would have been in the possession of the church or a noble family, its chain of custody recorded in painstaking detail. A real relic would not have been lost in an attic, forgotten for decades, and then sold for a pittance to an antique dealer. This lack of a solid paper trail is the strongest argument against the jar's claim. Jacques H. is now working on two parallel investigations. One is the physical evidence in the jar, the bones, the plaster, the cat remains. The other is the historical evidence, or rather the lack thereof. He's building a case on two fronts. He's trying to prove that the contents are fake, and he's trying to prove that the story is fake. He realizes that the two are probably connected. The person who created the contents also created the story. The forgery is a single unified act. He goes back to his chemist friend. He wants to know more about the plaster. What kind of plaster is it? Is it consistent with plaster from the Middle Ages, or is it from a later period? The chemist performs more advanced tests. He finds that the gypsum in the plaster is consistent with materials from the 16th or 17th century, not the 15th. This is a huge breakthrough. It means the jar's contents couldn't possibly have been collected from the pyre in 1431. The forgery was made at least a century, if not two, after Joan's death. You watch as Jacques H. meticulously writes down these new findings in his notebook, his handwriting neat and precise. The pieces of the puzzle are starting to fit together, but not in the way anyone expected. The jar is not a relic of a saint, it's a relic of a fraud. It's a testament to the power of a good story, a cautionary tale about the human desire to believe. The jar is a historical artifact in its own right, but its story is not what it claims to be. It's a forgery, a beautiful lie that has been passed down through generations, and Jacques H. is the man who is about to expose it. He knows that going public with this will be a firestorm. The public wants a hero, not a hoax. He's about to become the man who took Joan of Arc away from them, who shattered a beautiful illusion. But he's a man of integrity. He believes that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always the most important thing. He's a guardian of history, and it's his job to protect it from lies, no matter how well-intentioned they may be. The journey is far from over. The investigation has taken a bizarre and unexpected turn. You're back in Jacques H.'s study, but the atmosphere has changed. The initial excitement has given way to a kind of grim determination. The jar, once a symbol of national pride, now feels more like a cold case. The physical evidence is piling up, and it's all pointing in one direction: fraud. But the presence of the cat remains is a complete mystery. It's an anomaly, a detail so strange and out of place that it defies all logical explanation. It's the kind of detail that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Jacques H. is a historian, but he's also a pragmatist. He knows that the most outlandish theories are often the ones that get the most attention, but they're rarely the truth. So he sits with his chemist colleague, poring over the notes and microscope slides, trying to make sense of the cat. They've confirmed it's a fragment of a feline bone, not human, so what gives? He remembers a quirky or fringe tidbit from his historical studies. Medieval pharmacies, often called apothecaries, were known to use some unconventional ingredients in their remedies. They believed in the principle of like cures like, and would often use animal parts in their concoctions. A bit of powdered cat bone might have been a folk remedy for, say, a sore throat or some other minor ailment. It's a long shot, but it's a possibility. It's a hypothesis that connects the dots between the strange contents and the jar's origin in a pharmacy. This leads him to a more sinister thought. What if the jar's contents were not meant to be a historical relic at all, but rather a medieval apothecary's concoction, a mixture of different ingredients, including some burnt bone, some plaster, and yes, some powdered cat bone, all ground up and stored in a jar. Perhaps the jar was mislabeled, or the label was added much later. This would explain the presence of the plaster, a common binding agent in remedies, and the cat. The human bones would still be a mystery, but maybe they were a later addition, a bit of morbid flair to make the concoction seem more potent. Jacques H. finds himself in a tricky situation. He can't just come out and say, the remains of Joan of Arc are probably a medieval cat bone remedy. The public would laugh him out of Paris. He needs to build a stronger case, a case that connects the jar's contents to the story of the hoax. He's a detective, and he needs to find a motive and a perpetrator. The cat, he realises, is the key. It's a piece of evidence that can't be explained away by simple carelessness. It points to a deliberate act. This is where the investigation takes a new turn. Jacques H. begins to research the history of relic forgery. He knows it was a common practice in the Middle Ages and beyond, a mainstream historical fact that a huge number of relics in circulation were forgeries. A fragment of the true cross, a hair from a saint's head, a piece of bone from a martyr. All were highly prized and highly lucrative. A forger didn't need to be a brilliant criminal mastermind. They just needed a good story and some plausible-looking ingredients. He starts to think about the ingredients in the jar. Charred human bone, plaster, charred wood, and a cat bone. Where would a forger get all of this? Charred human bone is a gruesome thought, but cemeteries and charnel houses would not have been unheard of places to procure such a thing. Plaster is cheap and abundant. Charred wood is easy enough to get. And a cat? Well, a cat is a cat. The combination of these ingredients, he realises, is a perfect recipe for a plausible-looking relic. The plaster gives the mix a dusty, aged look. The charred wood adds a touch of authenticity. And the bones, well, they are bones. The cat bone, he theorises, was either a mistake, an oversight by a sloppy forger, or a deliberate addition for a reason we can no longer comprehend. The sheer audacity of the hoax is what strikes him. It's a beautiful lie, a forgery so clever and so well-timed that it fooled a nation for decades. And the man who exposed it is Jacques H. But he knows his work is not done. He needs to find more definitive proof. He needs to find a smoking gun, a piece of evidence that is so undeniable that even the most fervent believers in the jar will be forced to accept the truth. This is where a new line of inquiry opens up. Jacques H. begins to research the history of the jar itself, not just its contents. He and the chemist examine the terracotta. They've determined it's old, but they need to be more specific. They find an expert in pottery who can date the jar based on its style and composition. The expert, after a careful examination, concludes that the jar is likely from the 16th century, not the 15th. This is another nail in the coffin of the jar's authenticity. If the jar itself is a century too young, it couldn't possibly have held Joan's ashes from 1431. The jar and its contents are a package deal, and the package is a fake. The evidence is mounting. The lack of a historical paper trail, the flimsy provenance, the 16th century jar, the plaster, and the cat remains. It's a powerful combination of facts that all point to a single conclusion. But Jacques H. knows he needs to be careful. The public has a strong emotional investment in this story. He can't just dismiss it out of hand. He has to present his findings in a way that is both intellectually rigorous and respectful of the national sentiment. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the cat remains were the final nail in the coffin for the jar's authenticity, or a red herring that simply confused an already muddled investigation. Some argue that the cat remains were a key piece of evidence, a detail so strange that it could only point to a hoax. Others argue that it was a distraction, a detail that allowed the forgers to get away with the more subtle lies, the plaster, the dated jar. It's a debate that highlights the difficulty of historical forensics, where one strange detail can change the entire direction of an investigation. Jacques H. is a lonely figure in this. He's the man who has seen behind the curtain, who knows the truth. But he also knows that the truth is not always what people want to hear. He's a guardian of history, a protector of the past from the convenient lies of the present. He's about to write his final report, a document that will either confirm a national hero or expose a national hoax. And you, a silent observer, are there to watch him do it. The journey is almost over, but the most difficult part, the part where the truth is revealed, is yet to come. For over a century, the jar of supposed Joan of Arc remains, sat in various hands, a silent mystery. It moved from a dusty attic to a gentleman's cabinet of curiosities, and finally to Monsieur Hachette's pharmacy, where it became a national sensation. The story of a brave French official snatching a piece of a saint from the flames was a powerful narrative, one that a nation, in the throes of a patriotic revival, desperately wanted to believe. Jacques H., the meticulous archivist, did his best to investigate it with the tools of the 19th century, but his conclusions were based on limited technology and the interpretation of archival records. His work was a valiant effort, but it was, in the end, an educated guess. He exposed the jar's probable historical fraud, but he couldn't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. The doubt, that lingering whisper of possibility, was enough to keep the legend alive. The jar, with its peculiar contents and powerful story, faded from the public eye as the decades passed. It was bought by an American diplomat in the early 20th century, and it travelled across the Atlantic to be housed in a museum. The story of its discovery and the controversy surrounding it became a footnote in history books, a curious anecdote. But the jar itself, a physical object, a stubborn piece of reality, remained. It sat in a glass case, a silent testament to a historical moment, a tangible link to a story that may or may not have been true. Now, imagine yourself in the early 2000s. You're no longer in the flickering gaslight of 19th century Paris. You're in a modern, sterile laboratory, a place of bright lights and stainless steel, filled with the hum of sophisticated machinery. The scent is no longer of old paper and beeswax, but of sterile air and chemical reagents. The jar, a fragile artifact, is carefully placed on a table. It's time for a new investigation, one that Jacques H. could only have dreamed of. A team of French scientists and forensic experts has decided to reopen the case, to bring the full weight of 21st century science to bear on the mystery of the jar. This is where the story gets a dramatic, high-tech twist. They're not just looking at the bones under a microscope, they're looking at them at the molecular level. They're not just reading old chronicles, they're using technology that can read the chemical signature of the past itself. The new investigation is a fascinating blend of history and hard science, and you're here to witness it. The first step is a non-invasive one. The scientists use a technique called X-ray fluorescence, or XRF, to analyse the chemical composition of the bone fragments without damaging them. They don't just find calcium and phosphorus, the building blocks of bone. Our quirky or fringe tidbit is that they find trace amounts of lead, zinc, and other metals. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. The presence of these metals points to the remains being exposed to something unusual, something beyond simple fire. It's a chemical signature, a fingerprint of the past. The scientists theorise that the remains may have been in a vessel with a lead seal for a long period of time, or perhaps were mixed with materials that contained these metals. The XRF analysis is the first modern clue, and it's a powerful one. Next, they turn to the mysterious dark powder. Remember Jacques H.'s litmus test? It's time for something a little more sophisticated. The scientists use gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to analyse the powder's composition. They're able to identify the exact chemical compounds present in the powder. The results are stunning and completely unexpected. The powder isn't just bone ash and plaster. Our mainstream historical fact is that it contains a high concentration of vanillin, a compound that gives vanilla its distinctive smell. Vanillin, a substance that is a key component in perfumes and preservatives. But here's the kicker. Vanillin is not a stable compound. It degrades over time, and it should not have been present in any detectable amount after 600 years. Its presence is a very strong indicator that the remains were not 600 years old. The scientists also find fragments of a pine-based resin, a type of turpentine. This, combined with the vanillin, points to a clear conclusion. The remains had been treated with some sort of embalming or preservative compound. The scent that Jacques H. noticed, that faint, persistent smell, was not from a medieval pyre. It was from a 19th century preservative. The truth is starting to emerge, not from a dusty archive, but from a mass spectrometer. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the use of modern technology to debunk historical relics is a necessary act of truth-telling or a destructive force that robs history of its romance and mystery. Some argue that the cold, hard facts of science are the only way to separate fact from fiction. Others argue that the power of a legend, the emotional truth of a story, is just as important as the physical reality. The jar, once a symbol of faith, is now a flashpoint in a philosophical debate. The most damning evidence, however, is yet to come. The scientists turn their attention to the bones themselves. They extract a tiny sample and prepare it for carbon-14 dating. A a technique that was centuries away from Jacques H's grasp. Carbon dating measures the amount of carbon-14 remaining in an organic sample to determine its age. It's the gold standard for dating organic material, and it's about to deliver a verdict. The results come back, and they are a bombshell. The bone fragments are not from the 15th century. They are from a much later period. The exact date is somewhere between the 6th and 3rd century BCE, a period of time so far removed from Joan of Arc's life that it's almost comical. The bones, it turns out, are not from a medieval French woman, but from an ancient Egyptian. The discovery is a complete game-changer. The jar's contents are not a medieval forgery, but a much older, repurposed artefact. The cat remains, which had baffled Jacques, logically, suddenly make a horrifying kind of sense. The ancient Egyptians mummified cats. The jar's contents are the remains of an Egyptian mummy, a human and a cat, a gruesome package that was likely purchased in the 18th or 19th century and then given a new, more lucrative story. The truth is revealed, not by a historian, but by a machine. The jar is a beautiful lie, a magnificent fraud. The bones inside belong to an ancient Egyptian, not a French saint. The hope, the faith, the national pride that the jar inspired, all of it was built on a foundation of scientific error and historical amnesia. The journey to the truth is a long one, and you've just reached the end of the beginning. The jar's secret is out, but the story of its creation, the who and the why, is just beginning. The sterile hum of the laboratory is punctuated by the hushed whispers of the scientists. The results are in, and they are nothing short of a thunderclap. The initial radiocarbon dating has delivered a verdict so far-fetched, so utterly definitive, that it shatters every romantic notion that has surrounded the jar for over a century. The bones, those tiny, fragile fragments, are not from the 15th century. They are not from the era of longbows and chivalry, but from a time of pharaohs and pyramids. They are, in fact, from an ancient Egyptian, dating to the period between the 6th and 3rd century BCE. You feel a wave of something akin to vertigo. The ground has just shifted beneath your feet. The story you've been following, a tale of medieval saints and 19th century detectives, has just been completely rewritten. The jar in the Parisian pharmacy wasn't a medieval hoax, it was an ancient artefact given a modern lie. This is our mainstream historical fact. Carbon dating is an incredibly precise and powerful tool. It has been used to date everything from the Shroud of Turin to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it has a way of cutting through centuries of rumour and legend with the cold, hard certainty of science. The carbon-14 levels in the bones simply do not lie. There is no plausible scenario, no historical loophole, no scholarly debate that can possibly reconcile a 15th century French peasant with a 6th century BCE Egyptian. The implications are staggering. The entire foundation of the jar story, the patriotic fervour it inspired, the quiet belief of a pharmacist and a historian, all of it was built on a lie that was centuries older than anyone had ever suspected. The Joan of Arc remains were, in fact, the remains of an unknown person from an entirely different civilization. This is where the story of the cat takes a sudden, horrifying turn. Remember Jacques H's bewildered confusion at finding a piece of a cat bone in the jar? He had no context for it. But now, in the light of the new findings, it makes perfect, if macabre, sense. The ancient Egyptians mummified cats. They were considered sacred animals, often buried with their owners or in special catacombs. The jar's contents, then, were not the result of a sloppy forger's mistake. They were an intact, albeit desecrated, set of mummy remains, a human and a cat, a gruesome package that was likely purchased in the 18th or 19th century and then given a new, more lucrative story. The jar wasn't a product of medieval France. It was a souvenir from ancient Egypt, a memento mori that had been repurposed to fit a more profitable narrative. The scientists are now faced with a new set of questions. Who was this person? A wealthy merchant? A noble? It's impossible to tell from the small fragments of bone they have, but the dating is undeniable. The jar is a historical artefact in its own right, a testament to the long and winding journey of a lie. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit, in the 18th and 19th centuries there was a huge craze for Egyptian mummies. Wealthy Europeans would buy them on their trips to Egypt, often for a small fortune. They would host mummy unwrapping parties, a kind of macabre dinner entertainment where the ancient remains would be unwrapped for the amusement of the guests. It was a time of both fascination and profound disrespect for ancient cultures. The jar could have easily been a leftover from one of these parties, a small, sellable remnant that ended up in a forgotten corner of an antique shop. The story of a brave official scooping up Joan's ashes was likely a convenient fabrication, a way to make a piece of morbid trivia into a national treasure. The revelation of the jar's true age and origin is a bombshell that has the potential to rewrite a century of scholarship and public belief. The scientists know they can't just release this information without a thorough and rigorous process. They rerun the carbon dating tests. They use multiple labs, multiple methods, all with the same result. The bones are ancient, not medieval. The truth is irrefutable. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the discovery of the jar's true nature diminishes or enhances its historical significance. Some argue that the jar is now a more fascinating object than it ever was. It's no longer just a relic of a saint. It's a testament to the long history of forgery, the human desire for belief, and the power of a good story. It's an artifact that tells us more about the 19th century than it ever did about the 15th. Others argue that the jar is now just a curiosity, a footnote in the history of science, its original purpose as a symbol of faith and patriotism completely destroyed. The jar, once a symbol of unity, is now a symbol of intellectual division. The scientists, however, are a practical bunch. They've done their job. They've used the tools of modern science to answer a question that was unanswerable for centuries. The carbon dating results have settled the matter once and for all. The jar does not contain Joan of Arc's remains. The remains are from an ancient Egyptian. The final piece of the puzzle is in place, but the story isn't over. The who and the why, the motive behind the lie, is still a mystery. Who decided to put a new label on an old jar of mummy parts? Who was the forger who created this beautiful, compelling lie? The journey is taking a new turn, a more human one. You're no longer in the lab, but in the dusty back alleys of history searching for a ghost. The carbon-14 dating was a definitive blow, a scientific knockout punch to the legend. But the modern investigation wasn't done yet. The team of scientists knew that the bones told only part of the story. The rest of the tale, the part about the forgery itself, was written in the jar's other, more peculiar contents. So they turned their attention back to the dark, gritty powder, the substance that Jacques H. had noted for its strange perfumed smell. Using advanced chemical analysis, a technique called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, the scientists were able to break down the powder into its constituent parts, a kind of chemical fingerprint of the past. The results were a revelation, a stunning confirmation of the forgery. Our mainstream historical fact is that this technology can identify and quantify the chemical compounds in a sample with incredible precision. It's like being able to read the ingredients list of a meal that was cooked centuries ago. The analysis revealed a high concentration of vanillin, the primary flavour and aroma compound in vanilla. This was the same compound that gives vanilla its distinctive smell, a scent that Jacques H. had first noticed all those decades ago. But vanillin is a highly volatile compound. It degrades over time, and it should not have been present in any detectable amount in a 600-year-old sample. Its presence was a smoking gun. It proved that the remains had been treated with some kind of preservative or perfume much more recently than the 15th century. But the vanillin wasn't the only strange discovery. The analysis also found traces of a pine-based resin, a type of turpentine, and other aromatic compounds. These were not the chemical signatures of a bonfire. They were the chemical signatures of a mummification process, an embalming ritual, and a burial. The jar's contents weren't the simple charred remains of a pyre. They were a sophisticated and deliberate concoction, a product of a centuries-old preservation technique. The fragments of cat bone, which had so confused Jacques H., suddenly made perfect sense. The presence of vanillin, a compound not available in Europe until centuries after Joan of Arc's death, was the final, undeniable proof that the jar was a fake. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. Vanillin was first synthesized from coniferous wood tar in 1874, but it was used in Europe as a flavouring and fragrance long before that, made from the pods of the vanilla orchid, which were brought to Europe from Mexico in the 16th century. So, while it was a luxury item in the 17th and 18th centuries, it would have been completely unavailable in 1431. Its presence in the jar is an anachronism, a chronological error that completely gives away the lie. It's like finding a modern smartphone in a Roman tomb. It simply doesn't belong. This is a key moment in the investigation. The scientists have now confirmed the carbon dating results with a chemical analysis. The jar is not a relic of the 15th century. It is a historical artifact in its own right, a testament to a fascinating and audacious fraud. The question now shifts from is it real to what was it? The chemical fingerprint of the jar's contents suggests a new and more plausible hypothesis. The remains were likely an authentic Egyptian mummy, a souvenir from the 18th or 19th century when the mummy trade was booming. The mummy, perhaps incomplete or damaged, was then ground up and mixed with other substances, including the pine resin and vanillin, to create a plausible-looking relic. The plaster, which Jacques H. had found, was likely used as a binding agent or filler. The mixture was then placed in the jar, which the pottery expert had dated to the 16th century and given a new, more marketable story. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the chemical evidence is more powerful than the carbon dating results. The carbon dating proves the age of the bones, but the chemical analysis reveals the intent of the forger. It tells us not just that the jar is fake, but how it was made. It's a key piece of the puzzle, a window into the mind of the person who created this magnificent lie. The jar, once a symbol of faith, is now an object of intellectual fascination, a perfect example of how science can illuminate the darker corners of history. The team of scientists, their work now complete, writes a final report. The report details the carbon dating results, the chemical analysis, and the historical context. It is a work of immense scholarly rigour, a definitive refutation of the jar's claim. They conclude, without a shadow of a doubt, that the jar does not contain the remains of Joan of Arc. It contains the remains of an ancient Egyptian mummy and a cat, a bizarre and fascinating artefact that has fooled historians and the public for over a century. As you stand there, a silent observer in the laboratory, you feel a sense of closure. The mystery is solved. The truth has been revealed, not by a single detective, but by a team of scientists, a group of people working together to unravel a century-old lie. The jar, a symbol of a national hero, is now a symbol of a scientific triumph. It is a testament to the power of modern technology to cut through centuries of rumour and legend to get to the truth. But the story isn't over. The who and the why, the motive behind the lie, is still a mystery. Who was the forger who created this beautiful, compelling lie? The journey is taking a new turn, a more human one. You're no longer in the lab, but in the dusty back alleys of history searching for a ghost. The final scientific verdict has been delivered, and it's a powerful one. The jar does not contain the remains of Joan of Arc, but rather a repurposed ancient Egyptian mummy. The carbon dating and chemical analysis have settled the matter with a precision that Jacques H. could never have dreamed of. But the investigation into the jar's true purpose and origin is far from over. The chemical analysis has revealed something else, a detail that points not to a simple forgery, but to a fascinating and a bit gross historical reality. Remember the vanillin, the pine resin, and the cat remains. They all point to a deliberate concoction, a mixture created for a specific purpose. And that purpose, the scientists now theorise, wasn't just to fool a few gullible antiquarians, it was to create a remedy. A weird, medieval remedy. You're no longer in a lab, but in a cluttered, chaotic medieval apothecary, a place smelling of dried herbs, vinegar, and something a little more sinister. A place where the line between medicine and magic was as thin as a single strand of cobweb. This is our mainstream historical fact. Medieval and early modern pharmacies used a huge variety of bizarre and often ineffective ingredients. They believed in the principle of like cures like, and they would often use ground-up animal parts, herbs, and other substances in their concoctions. Mummies, for example, were a particularly sought-after ingredient. Ground-up mummy, or mumia, was believed to have a wide variety of curative properties, from healing bruises to curing the plague. It was a common, if expensive, ingredient in the apothecary's cabinet. The jar's contents, a mix of human bone, cat bone, resin, and other compounds, fits perfectly into this context. It's not a historical relic, it's a historical recipe. The presence of the cat remains, which so confused Jacques, now makes a certain kind of horrifying sense. In some medieval folk medicine, powdered cat bone was believed to cure everything from jaundice to fever. The plaster, which also seemed so out of place, was a common binding agent for these powders, a way to make them into a pill or a paste. The vanillin and pine resin would have served a double purpose. They would have made the concoction smell better, a necessity when you're working with ground-up mummies, and they would have acted as a preservative. The jar, then, was not a failed attempt at a forgery. It was a successful attempt at a scam. It was a jar of medieval snake oil, a fraudulent remedy sold to a desperate and gullible public. The story of Joan of Arc's ashes was likely added much later, a brilliant piece of marketing that transformed a worthless jar of powdered mummy into a priceless national treasure. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the Middle Ages, the demand for mummy powder was so high that unscrupulous merchants would often sell ground-up animal or even human remains as genuine mumia. They would take the bones from a recent burial, dry them, grind them up, and sell them as a cure-all. The idea that the jar's contents are a concoction of different human and animal bones fits perfectly with this historical practice. The forger wasn't just faking a relic, they were faking a remedy, and then later, someone else faked a relic out of the fake remedy. It's a layer cake of fraud. This is a key moment in our understanding of the jar. It's no longer just a piece of evidence in a historical mystery. It's a window into the weird, often gruesome world of medieval medicine. It's a testament to the power of a good lie, and the human desire for a cure, no matter how outlandish. The jar, a beautiful and compelling lie, is now a fascinating and revolting truth. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the jar's origin as a medicinal concoction makes the later historical forgery more or less forgivable. Was the person who first created the remedy a simple con artist, or were they a believer in the folk medicine of their time? Was the person who later turned it into a relic a cynical opportunist, or were they a patriot who genuinely believed in the power of a good story? The jar's journey is a microcosm of human belief, a story of faith, fraud, and the blurred lines in between. The discovery of the jar's true nature is a stunning conclusion to a century-long investigation. But it leaves us with one final, and perhaps most important question. Who was the person who created this magnificent lie? Who was the forger who decided to take a jar of powdered mummy and give it a new, more powerful, and more profitable story? The investigation is no longer about the jar. It's about the ghost of a forger, a ghost that has been haunting history for over a century. You stand there, a silent observer in the ghostly apothecary, a place where truth and lies are ground up together into a fine powder. You know the jar's contents. You know its true age. But you don't know who created the lie. You're a detective on the hunt for a ghost, and the only evidence you have is a jar of powdered mummy, a bizarre and fascinating historical artifact that has one last secret to tell. The journey is far from over. The scientific and historical evidence has all converged on a single, undeniable truth. The jar is a magnificent fraud. But the mystery isn't over. A new line of inquiry opens up, one that is more about human nature than chemistry or carbon dating. The question is no longer what is in the jar, but who put it there, and why. You're no longer in a lab or a dusty apothecary. You're walking the streets of 19th century Paris, a city of contrasts, where brilliant minds and con artists often rubbed shoulders. You're on the trail of a ghost, a forger whose work has fooled a nation for over a century. Jacques H., the archivist, had no hope of finding the forger. He lacked the tools and the context. But with the modern scientific findings in hand, a new generation of historical detectives can begin to piece together the identity of the perpetrator. They start with the most obvious question. Who had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to create such a compelling forgery? The answer, they believe, lies in the burgeoning market for historical relics in the 18th and 19th centuries. This is our mainstream historical fact. The Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and the Napoleonic Wars had created a massive market for historical artefacts. Old noble families were selling off their possessions, churches were being plundered, and the demand for a tangible connection to the past was at an all-time high. A new class of people, the antiquarians, the collectors, and the dealers, had emerged. They were a mix of genuine scholars, passionate collectors, and outright fraudsters. The perpetrator, the new investigators theorize, was likely one of these people. A man, or perhaps a woman, who knows, with a good eye for a story and a talent for creating a convincing fake. They would have needed access to a few key ingredients: a jar of the right period, a batch of genuine human remains, the mummy, and a powerful, compelling story, Joan of Arc. The mummy could have been purchased from one of the many dealers in Egyptian artefacts. The jar could have been found in a flea market. The story, the most valuable part of the forgery, was a product of the zeitgeist. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. One of the most famous purveyors of forged relics in the late 18th century was a man known as the Saint Maker. He was a brilliant artisan who specialised in creating convincing fakes of religious relics. He would take a piece of bone from a common burial ground, wrap it in old cloth, and place it in a beautiful reliquary, complete with a forged certificate of authenticity. His forgeries were so good that they fooled some of the most respected church officials of his day. It's a testament to the fact that the forger of the Joan of Arc jar was not working in a vacuum. They were a part of a well-established, if illicit, industry. The trail to the forger is cold, but the investigators can use the evidence from the jar to build a profile. The forger was clever, but not a genius. The presence of the cat remains, and the plaster suggests a certain carelessness. The use of vanillin points to a knowledge of modern, for the time, chemistry, but not a complete understanding of its properties. The use of a 16th century jar to hold what was supposed to be a 15th century relic is a chronological error, a sloppy mistake that betrays a certain lack of scholarly rigour. This person was not a meticulous academic. They were a pragmatic opportunist. Historians still argue whether the forger was a single individual or a collaboration. It's possible that the jar's contents and the jar's story were created by different people at different times. A man could have had a jar of powdered mummy, a kind of morbid curiosity, and sold it to another man, a collector, who then, years later, decided to give it a new, more valuable story. The forgery, in this case, would not be a single, deliberate act, but a more organic process of collective delusion and opportunism. The search for the forger, however, leads us to a more unsettling conclusion. The true perpetrator may not have been a single person at all, but rather the collective desire of a nation. The forger, whoever they were, was simply providing a product that the public wanted. They were filling a void, a deep-seated need for a tangible connection to a hero. The lie was so successful because it was a lie that everyone, from the simple pharmacist to the respected archivist, wanted to believe. The forgery was not just a historical artifact, it was a psychological one, a mirror held up to the face of a nation. You stand there, a silent observer in the past, watching the parade of antiquarians, collectors and scholars. You realise that the search for a single, identifiable villain is probably a fool's errand. The jar is not a crime scene with a single perpetrator. It is a historical testament to a collective delusion. The forger, the true villain of the story, is a ghost. They are the ghost of a nation's desire for a hero, and a ghost of a centuries-old lie. The jar, a testament to this, has a new story to tell. A story about the power of belief, the frailty of truth, and the dark corners of human nature. The journey is far from over. You're a fly on the wall, but now the wall isn't in a Parisian study or a modern lab. It's in the hallowed halls of a 19th century church, a place of stained glass and whispered prayers. The air is thick with the scent of incense and old wax. Outside, the streets of France are filled with a public that is on fire with a renewed sense of national pride. The news of the jar, the supposed remains of Joan of Arc, has not been met with scepticism, but with a fervent, almost religious devotion. The public wants to believe, and in their collective desire, they create a market for the very thing they are seeking. This is our mainstream historical fact. The demand for relics, particularly those of saints, has been a driving force in human history for millennia. In the Middle Ages, the veneration of relics was a cornerstone of Christian practice. A piece of a saint's bone, a sliver of the true cross, a lock of hair from a martyr. These were not just historical artifacts. They were sacred objects, believed to possess divine power. Pilgrims would travel for weeks, even months, to touch or see a relic, believing it could heal their bodies or save their souls. This deep-seated desire created a massive industry, a market for both genuine and, more often than not, fraudulent relics. The jar of Joan of Arc remains, even with its dubious provenance and peculiar contents, fits perfectly into this historical context. The public's desire for a tangible connection to their hero, their saint, was so strong that it created a demand that an unscrupulous person, or a series of unscrupulous people, was only too happy to fill. The forger, whoever they were, didn't just create a fake, they created a product for a ready and willing market. The jar wasn't just a physical object, it was a psychological one. It was a projection of a nation's hopes and dreams, a mirror held up to their collective longing. The story of Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who saved France, was a powerful one, a national myth that resonated with the French people in the 19th century. The jar, a physical piece of that myth, was a potent symbol. It was proof that the legend was real, that the hero was a real person, and that her sacrifice was a real event, now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The line between religious devotion and historical curiosity was incredibly blurry in the 19th century. A wealthy collector might have a reliquary with a piece of a saint's bone in it right next to a fossilised dinosaur egg. The objects were valued not just for their spiritual significance, but also for their rarity and their ability to tell a story. The jar, with its powerful narrative, would have been a prized possession in such a collection. It was a conversation piece, a way to show off both your piety and your historical acumen. It was a beautiful lie that was more valuable than the ugly truth. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the public's desire for relics is a sign of a deep and meaningful faith or a form of historical escapism. Some argue that the need for tangible objects to connect to the past is a fundamental human need, a way of grounding ourselves in a world that can feel chaotic and disconnected. Others argue that it is a form of intellectual laziness, a way of avoiding the difficult and complex truths of history. The jar, a perfect symbol of this debate, is a testament to the power of a story over the power of a fact. The forger of the jar understood this perfectly. They understood that the story was more important than the substance. They understood that the public would overlook the inconsistencies, the historical gaps, and the weird contents, because the narrative was so powerful. The jar was not a product of historical research. It was a product of psychological insight. The forger was not just a criminal. They were a genius marketer, a master storyteller. You stand in the church watching the faithful, and you realize that the forger's greatest creation was not the jar, but the belief it inspired. The jar is a testament to the fact that people are often willing to believe a beautiful lie over a difficult truth. It is a story of faith, fraud, and the blurred lines in between. The journey is far from over. The jar, with its powerful story and its bizarre contents, did more than just fool a nation. It fundamentally shaped the public's perception of Joan of Arc herself. You're no longer in a church, but in the lecture halls and art galleries of the 19th and early 20th centuries, where the image of Joan is being remade. The discovery of the relics, even with the lingering doubts, transformed her from a historical figure into a tangible physical presence. She was no longer just a character in a history book. She was a woman whose remains, a part of her, had been found. This is a mainstream historical fact. The canonization of Joan of Arc in 1920 was a powerful event that cemented her place as a national hero and a saint. But the process of venerating her started much earlier, and the jar played a significant role. The existence of a physical relic, a piece of her, provided a focal point for the devotion. It gave people something to rally around, something to believe in. The jar wasn't just a historical artifact, it was a religious one. It was a tangible link to a woman who had, in the eyes of many, performed miracles. The public's perception of Joan changed. She became less of a historical figure and more of a spiritual one. The jar, a testament to her fiery martyrdom, solidified her image as a virgin martyr, a woman who sacrificed everything for her faith and her country. The details of her life, the political complexities of her trial, the military genius she displayed, all of that faded into the background. The jar, a simple terracotta pot of ashes, became a powerful and enduring symbol of her sacrifice. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the late 19th century, a number of other relics of Joan of Arc began to appear on the market. A sword, a banner, a piece of her armour, all were, of course, forgeries. But the existence of the jar of ashes gave these other fakes a certain legitimacy. If the central relic was real, why not the others? It created a feedback loop of fraud, where one lie enabled another. The jar became the anchor for an entire constellation of faked artifacts, all of them designed to prey on the public's desire for a tangible connection to their hero. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the discovery of the jar was ultimately a positive or negative thing for Joan of Arc's legacy. Some argue that it helped to solidify her image as a saint and a national hero, a process that was vital for a nation struggling with its identity. Others argue that it ultimately did a disservice to her, reducing a complex, brilliant and deeply human woman to a simple symbol of martyrdom. The jar, in this context, is a kind of historical cage, a small pot that held not just ashes, but a nation's hopes and fears. The legacy of the jar is a complex one. It's a story of fraud, but it's also a story of faith. It's a story of a lie that was so beautiful, so compelling, that it became a kind of truth. The people who believed in the jar were not stupid or gullible. They were simply human. They wanted to believe in something bigger than themselves, something that could connect them to a glorious and powerful past. The jar provided that connection, and in doing so, it became more than just an artifact. It became a piece of a nation's soul. The story of the jar is a powerful reminder that history is not just a collection of facts. It is a collection of stories, and the stories we tell ourselves, even the ones that are not true, can have a profound and lasting impact. The jar, with its bizarre contents and its beautiful lie, is a testament to that. It's a testament to the power of belief, the frailty of truth, and the enduring human desire for a hero. The journey is far from over. The jar, which had been a symbol of national pride, was now revealed to be a symbol of a national fraud. The conclusion of the official investigation, spearheaded by the French team of modern scientists, was a bombshell. The carbon dating was irrefutable. The chemical analysis was undeniable. The bones were from an ancient Egyptian, not a medieval French woman. The public, who for over a century had believed in the jar, was suddenly faced with a difficult truth. You're no longer in the lab or the archive. You're out in the streets of France, watching the public's varied and often emotional reactions unfold. The news hit the media with a bang. Newspapers, a far more powerful and influential force in the early 2000s than they had been in the 19th century, ran headlines that were a mix of sensationalism and sombre reality. The Holy Grail of French history was revealed to be a fake. The Maid of Orleans had been an Egyptian mummy all along. The public reaction was a complex mixture of emotions. Some people were angry, feeling that they had been lied to, that a beautiful and powerful story had been cruelly snatched away from them. Others were saddened, mourning the loss of a tangible connection to a hero they had always held dear. This is our mainstream historical fact. The debunking of historical relics is often met with a great deal of public resistance. People have a deep emotional and cultural investment in these stories. They want to believe in the tangible, the miraculous, the heroic. The jar had been more than just a historical artifact. It had been a piece of their national identity. The loss of it was a profound one. For many, it wasn't just a lie that was exposed, it was a piece of their history that was taken away. But there was another reaction, a more intellectual and, in a way, more optimistic one. For some, the new findings didn't diminish the jar's significance, they enhanced it. The jar was no longer just a relic of a saint, it was a relic of a fraud, a testament to the power of a story, a window into the weird and wonderful world of 19th century antiquarianism. It was a fascinating historical object in its own right, a piece of a new story that was just as compelling as the old one. The jar was no longer a symbol of Joan of Arc's sacrifice, but a symbol of the human desire to believe. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the wake of the new findings, a small but vocal group of conspiracy theorists emerged. They claimed that the new scientific findings were a fabrication, a plot by a shadowy organisation to discredit the Catholic Church and French nationalism. They argued that the scientists had deliberately tampered with the carbon dating results and that the chemical analysis was a hoax. These theories, while completely unfounded, show the deep emotional and cultural investment people had in the jar story. The truth in this case was not just a matter of science, it was a matter of faith. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the scientific community has a moral obligation to protect the public from difficult truths. Should the scientists have kept their findings to themselves, allowing the public to continue to believe in a beautiful, if false, story? Or was their obligation to the truth, to the cold, hard facts of science? The jar, once a symbol of unity, was now a flashpoint in a philosophical debate about the nature of history, truth, and belief. The conclusion of the investigation was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one. The jar, now housed in a museum with a new, more accurate label, became a testament to the power of scientific discovery. It was a reminder that history is not static. It is a living, breathing thing that is constantly being rewritten. It was a reminder that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always the most important thing. You stand in front of the display case, a silent observer in a modern museum. The jar is there, a small terracotta pot with a new plaque. The plaque doesn't mention Joan of Arc at all. It talks about the jar's true origins, the ancient Egyptian mummy, the 19th century forger, the long and winding journey of a lie. The story is no longer about a saint. It is a story about a jar, and the people who have looked at it, and the stories they have told themselves about it. The jar is a testament to the fact that history is not just about the big events, the battles, the kings, and the saints. It is also about the small things, the lies we tell ourselves, the stories we invent to make sense of a world that is often chaotic and confusing. The jar is a beautiful lie, but the story of its discovery, the story of the truth that was found within it, is a beautiful and compelling truth. The journey is far from over. The jar, now a debunked relic and a verified forgery, sits in a museum, a silent testament to a century-long lie. But the story isn't just about the facts. It's about the human desire that fueled the lie in the first place. You're no longer an outside observer, but an introspective one, sitting in a quiet, contemplative space, pondering the psychological reasons why we're so eager to believe in tangible historical artifacts. Why do we want to touch the past, to hold a piece of it in our hands, even when the evidence is so flimsy? The answer, I think, lies in our fundamental human need for connection. History can feel abstract, a series of names, dates, and places that are difficult to relate to. A relic, a physical object that was supposedly touched or owned by a historical figure, changes all that. It makes the past real. It makes a saint, a hero, a king, a queen, a flesh and blood person just like us. It's a bridge across time, a way of reaching out and touching a hand that has been dust for centuries. The jar, for all its scientific falsity, was a powerful psychological truth. It was a tangible link to a hero, a way of grounding a national myth in a physical object. This is our mainstream historical fact. The human brain is hardwired for storytelling. We are creatures of narrative. We use stories to make sense of the world, to find meaning in chaos, and to connect with others. A relic is not just an object, it's a story. The story of Joan of Arc, the peasant girl who saved France, is a powerful one. The story of her remains, of a brave official snatching them from the flames, is a powerful subplot. The jar, a beautiful and compelling lie, was a perfect piece of this narrative. It was a story that people wanted to hear, and a story they wanted to believe. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the field of psychology, there's a concept called magical thinking, where a person believes that their thoughts or actions can influence the world in a way that defies the laws of nature. A relic, for many people, falls into this category. They believe that a physical object that was in contact with a saint can still possess some of their power, a kind of spiritual residue. The jar, for all its scientific fraudulence, was, for many people, a powerful object of magical thinking. It was a piece of a saint that could be seen, touched, and venerated. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the human desire for relics is a positive or a negative thing. Some argue that it is a beautiful and meaningful way of connecting to the past, a way of keeping our heroes and our history alive. They argue that the emotional truth of a story is just as important as the scientific fact. Others argue that it is a dangerous form of historical escapism, a way of avoiding the difficult and complex truths of history. They argue that a reliance on relics can lead to a kind of intellectual laziness, a kind of belief in a magical version of the past that is more comforting than the real one. The jar, once a symbol of unity, is now a symbol of this intellectual division. It's a testament to the fact that history is not just about the big events, the battles, the kings, and the saints. It is also about the small things, the lies we tell ourselves, the stories we invent to make sense of a world that is often chaotic and confusing. The jar is a beautiful lie, but the story of its discovery, the story of the truth that was found within it, is a beautiful and compelling truth. The jar, a small terracotta pot that once held a lie, now holds a far more important truth. It is a testament to the fact that our desire to connect with the past is so strong that we are often willing to believe in a beautiful fiction. The jar is a reminder that the stories we tell ourselves, even the ones that are not true, can have a profound and lasting impact. It is a testament to the power of belief, the frailty of truth, and the enduring human desire for a hero. The journey is far from over. The jar, now a symbol of a debunked legend, is a unique historical object, a testament not to Joan of Arc, but to a centuries-old fraud. But it is far from being the only famous relic to have faced such scrutiny. You're no longer in a museum or a quiet study. You're on a grand tour of history's most famous and most controversial artefacts, a journey that reveals a pattern of hope, belief, and, more often than not, elaborate deception. This is a story about the universal human desire to believe in something tangible, something that connects us to a greater past, and the long and often painful process of separating fact from fiction. This is our mainstream historical fact. The history of relics is rife with forgeries. The Catholic Church, in its long history, has had to constantly grapple with the authenticity of its most sacred objects. A famous example is the Shroud of Turin, a piece of linen cloth that is believed by many to be the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. For centuries, it has been a focal point of Christian devotion, attracting millions of pilgrims. But in 1988, a team of scientists performed carbon dating tests on the shroud. The results were a bombshell. The shroud dated to the Middle Ages, not the time of Christ. The shroud, for all its spiritual significance, was a historical fake. The debate, however, rages on, with many believers arguing that the carbon dating was flawed, or that the shroud was miraculously repaired with newer fibres. The Shroud of Turin is a perfect example of a relic that, like our jar, has a powerful story that is at odds with the cold, hard facts of science. The Shroud of Turin, however, is a mere warm-up act. Let's talk about the true cross. According to legend, the true cross is the cross on which Jesus was crucified. It was supposedly discovered by Saint Helena, the mother of Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. Fragments of the cross were then distributed to churches all over the world, becoming some of the most sacred and sought-after relics in Christendom. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The French Protestant theologian John Calvin once quipped that if all the fragments of the true cross were gathered together, they would fill an entire cargo ship. He was, of course, exaggerating for effect, but he had a point. The sheer number of true cross fragments in existence makes it statistically impossible for them all to be genuine. The vast majority are, without a doubt, forgeries. The Church itself has, over the centuries, been forced to quietly admit that many of these relics are of questionable origin, a quiet concession to the reality of historical fraud. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the discovery of a relic's fraudulent nature diminishes its spiritual or historical significance. Some argue that the spiritual power of a relic comes not from its physical authenticity, but from the belief it inspires. The Shroud of Turin, even if it's a medieval forgery, is still a powerful symbol of faith for millions of people. Others argue that a lie, no matter how well-intentioned, is still a lie, and that the pursuit of historical truth is paramount. They argue that the veneration of a known forgery is a form of intellectual dishonesty, a kind of historical escapism that ultimately does a disservice to our understanding of the past. The Jar of Joan of Arc's remains, then, is not a unique case. It is part of a long and fascinating history of relics, a history that is a microcosm of human belief. It is a story about our deep desire to connect with the past, to touch our heroes, and to find meaning in the chaos of history. The jar is a testament to the fact that we are often willing to believe a beautiful lie over a difficult truth. The jar is a kind of historical lens, a way of looking at a much larger and more complex issue. It's a reminder that relics, no matter how sacred, are still just physical objects. They are subject to the same laws of science and history as everything else. They can be faked. They can be mistaken. They can be misunderstood. The real story, the real power, lies not in the object itself, but in the story we tell about it. The jar, which had been a symbol of national pride, is now a symbol of intellectual honesty. It is a reminder that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always the most important thing. It is a testament to the power of science, to cut through centuries of rumour and legend to get to the truth. And it is a testament to the fact that the pursuit of truth, while often difficult and painful, is a noble and necessary one. The journey is far from over. The journey to the truth of the jar's contents has been a long and winding one. We've travelled from a Parisian pharmacy in 1867 to a modern laboratory in the 2000s, from the cold, hard facts of a historical record to the aha moment of a scientific discovery. But we have one last stop to make. We must go back to the beginning, back to the dusty study of the man who started it all, Jacques H. We must revisit his initial instincts, his early doubts, and his valiant, if ultimately limited, attempt to solve the mystery. You're back in his study, a silent observer of a ghost, a man who, in the flickering gaslight of the 19th century, was a lone voice of reason in a sea of patriotic fervour. Jacques H. was a man of his time, a scholar who believed in the power of the written word, the truth found in the margins of a centuries-old manuscript. His tools were a magnifying glass, a keen intellect, and a vast knowledge of medieval history. He lacked the carbon dating, the mass spectrometry, and the X-ray fluorescence that would ultimately solve the case. But he had something else, a healthy dose of scepticism. This is our mainstream historical fact. Jacques H.'s initial investigation was a masterclass in intellectual honesty and scholarly rigour. He didn't just accept the jar's claim at face value. He questioned it. He looked for a paper trail and found none. He looked for a historical record of the jar's supposed origin and found a gaping hole. He noted the inconsistencies, the oddities, the strange smell, and the presence of the plaster. His initial, albeit unproven, conclusion was that the jar was likely a forgery. He had, with the limited tools at his disposal, arrived at the right conclusion. He was, in a way, a prophet, a man who saw the truth long before science could prove it. But his investigation was also a story of frustration. The lack of a definitive scientific method to prove his theory was his downfall. He could present the evidence for fraud, but he couldn't prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. The doubt, that lingering whisper of possibility, was enough to keep the legend alive for over a century. He was a man with a compelling case, but no jury. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the late 19th century, there was a popular trend among certain amateur historians to prove the authenticity of relics using dubious pseudo-scientific methods. They would perform things like smell tests or feel tests, where they would claim to be able to detect the spiritual energy of a relic. These people, of course, were dismissed by serious scholars, but they were incredibly popular with the public. Jacques H. had to constantly fight against this kind of sensationalism, a kind of historical snake oil salesman who was selling a feel-good version of the past. He was a man of science in a world of magic, and it was a lonely position to be in. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Jacques H.'s initial instincts were a testament to the power of human intellect or a lucky guess. Some argue that his ability to see the cracks in the story, even without the scientific tools to prove it, was a sign of his genius. They argue that he was a brilliant historical detective who simply lacked the technology to close his case. Others argue that his conclusion, while correct, was not a definitive one. They argue that it was based on circumstantial evidence and a healthy dose of skepticism, and that without the modern scientific findings, the jar's authenticity would have remained an open question. The jar is a testament to Jacques H's intellectual honesty. He was a man who, in a time of great patriotic fervour, refused to let a good story get in the way of a difficult truth. He was a guardian of history, a protector of the past from the convenient lies of the present. He was, in a way, a hero of our story, a man who, in his own way, fought a centuries-old lie with the only tools he had, his mind. You stand there, a silent observer, watching the ghost of Jacques H. pore over his notes, his face a mask of concentration and frustration. You realise that his journey was not in vain. His work, his meticulous notes, his careful scepticism, all of it laid the groundwork for the modern investigation. He was a pioneer, a man who, in a time of limited technology, saw a truth that would take over a century to prove. The jar, a symbol of a debunked legend, is also a symbol of intellectual triumph. It is a testament to the power of skepticism, the importance of questioning a good story, and the long and winding journey of a lie. The journey is far from over. The journey is over. We have followed the jar from a dusty Parisian pharmacy in 1867 to a modern sterile laboratory in the 21st century. We have witnessed a century-long saga of belief, patriotism, and scientific discovery. The final verdict has been delivered, not by a single man, but by a symphony of modern technology and historical scholarship. The conclusion is definitive, irrefutable, and in its own way more fascinating than the legend it replaced. The jar does not contain the remains of Joan of Arc. It contains the remains of an ancient Egyptian mummy and a cat, a bizarre and magnificent historical fraud. This is our mainstream historical fact. The final report, a culmination of all the scientific and historical evidence, was a watershed moment in the field of forensic history. It proved that modern science could definitively answer questions that had baffled historians for centuries. The carbon dating, the chemical analysis of the vanillin and the pine resin, the pottery experts' dating of the jar, all of it came together to form an undeniable case against the jar's authenticity. The report was a testament to the power of scientific collaboration and the importance of intellectual honesty. It was a new chapter in the study of historical relics, a reminder that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is always the most important thing. But the conclusion of the case did not close the book on the jar. It simply opened a new one. The jar, now housed in a museum with a new, more accurate label, became a testament to a new and more complex story. It was no longer a relic of a saint. It was a relic of a fraud. It was a testament to the power of a story, the human desire to believe, and the long and winding journey of a lie. The jar, in its new context, became a more powerful and more significant historical object than it ever was as a supposed relic of a saint. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. In the wake of the new findings, a new debate emerged among historians and folklorists. What was the true origin of the story of the brave official Pierre de Thérèse, who supposedly collected the ashes from the pyre? The name Thérèse, it turns out, is a phonetic play on the French word for to carry, and the phrase Pierre de Thérèse can be interpreted as stone carrier. This led to a theory that the name was not a real one, but a symbolic one, a kind of historical joke or a mnemonic device meant to be a clue. The forger, it was theorised, was leaving a subtle calling card, a wink to anyone clever enough to figure it out. The name was not a historical fact. It was a piece of historical fiction. This is a moment of profound scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the discovery of the jar's true nature diminishes or enhances its historical significance. Some argue that the jar, as a symbol of a national hero, was a powerful and meaningful object, and that the scientific debunking of it was a cruel and unnecessary act. They argue that the emotional truth of a story is just as important as the scientific fact. Others argue that the jar, as a testament to the power of human delusion and the long history of forgery, is a more fascinating and more significant historical object now than it ever was before. They argue that the truth, no matter how difficult, is always the most important thing. The jar is now a testament to this intellectual division. It is a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts, it is a collection of stories, and the stories we tell ourselves, even the ones that are not true, can have a profound and lasting impact. The jar, with its bizarre contents and its beautiful lie, is a testament to that. It is a testament to the power of belief, the frailty of truth, and the enduring human desire for a hero. The journey is over, but the story of the jar is not. It is a story that will continue to be told, a story that will continue to evolve. It is a story that reminds us that the past is not a static place. It is a living, breathing thing that is constantly being rewritten, reinterpreted, and re-examined. The jar, a small terracotta pot that once held a lie, now holds a far more important truth. It is a testament to the fact that our desire to connect with the past is so strong that we are often willing to believe in a beautiful fiction. The jar is a reminder that the stories we tell ourselves, even the ones that are not true, can have a profound and lasting impact. It is a testament to the power of belief, the frailty of truth, and the enduring human desire for a hero. The journey is far from over. Now, as the screen fades to black, the noise of the world outside your room starts to feel a little more distant. The hum of the fan, the soft ticking of a clock, maybe the distant sound of a car. These are the simple, peaceful things that bring you back to the present. The ghost of Jacques H. has finally found the answers he was seeking, and the jar, with all its beautiful lies, has found a new, more honest story. The mysteries of the past often fade with the morning light, replaced by the simple, quiet truths of the day. So, as the last echoes of our story fade into the silence, let the weight of history fall away. The truth is found, the story is told. All that's left is the gentle drift into a calm, restful night. The past is a curious place, but the present is where we find our peace. Sleep now, and let the mysteries of tomorrow remain a gentle, unwritten page.